I recently played out a position against a student of mine that presented a very instructive moment. So here it is. I was black, and we have this quite unbalanced pawn structure where white obviously has a strong protected passed pawn on d5, but black has, the queen side majority pawns. In general, the position is quite locked, and I decided to use this opportunity to attack the a5 pawn, which there is no obvious way to defend for white. So it's definitely a critical moment for white, right? And what should you be focusing on? I mean, the natural thing is to focus on this pawn, which I've left undefended. So you can take it with the bishop. If you want to open your mind to more extravagant possibilities, you can consider taking it with the rook. So I guess the first place to start is taking it with the bishop, which is both very natural and, probably the first place you want to go in your thinking, but it also happens to be very nice for black because you're giving up a very valuable bishop in this trade, and you're leaving yourself with a very poor bishop with all the pawns in the same color on the light squares, and black takes this pawn. So we arrived at this position in the game, which is actually, the decision taken by my student. And unfortunately, white faces a very unpleasant task here because the battle is going to be over the dark squares. I'm already threatening to win the queen. And of course, white can avoid that, but the problem of the dark squares is going to remain, and white's passive minor pieces are really not helping. So basically, black just has a great position. I wasn't even in a hurry to play bishop b6 because that can always be done. I was just taking control of the c file and eventually moved the bishop to the longer diagonal. So yeah, I mean, you can just see that like the way this game is going, it's going the only way it can when one side controls an entire color complex, right? And these squares are so perpetually weak that you actually have to be, constantly on the lookout for getting mated on one of them, right? The bishop is very difficult to improve. And so while white has one still strong thing about their position, the d pawn, but it's not enough to outweigh all these problems. So what else could white have done other than bishop c5? Well, I'll tell you what I was looking at, guys. I was looking at rook c5. Yeah, I guess because, my experience was telling me there's just no way you can give up your dark squared bishop as white in this position. So I was actually willing to give up the rook, but not the bishop. And the line that I was considering was this one. So black takes the pawn, and it was based on this move b4. Yeah, b4 is, kind of an important part of the plan. First of all, because black has a lot of threats against the knight, the bishop. Rook takes c5 is a threat, followed by bishop b6. So b4 tries to deal with all of that. And I did take a look at this move for a second, but, it just looks like white can take with the pawn, not the queen. So that looked pretty decent for white. And then I was evaluating this position, and I thought, this is not so bad for white. Yes, white is down in exchange, but they've kept the all-important bishop. This pawn is a backwards pawn that is not moving anywhere. This pawn is very powerful still. So I thought this was definitely a position with compensation for white. And I certainly would prefer this decision over the decision to give up the dark squared bishop, nominally keeping the material even, but, making huge positional concessions, right? And also, in general, an exchange sacrifice like this really changes the dynamic of the game, does give white some sort of playing initiative. It's very hard to get rid of this bishop because even if I challenge it, I can't really take it and give white those connected passed pawns. The rooks are not too powerful. So yeah, I mean, it seemed like not a bad decision for white. However, there is a flaw, and the flaw is that rook c5 actually does exist. And it's a cool concept because there's bishop c3. I didn't see this at all. So black does have a direct refutation of this exchange sacrifice attempt because now the rook is hanging and the huge threat of winning the queen. So actually those dark squares, we get to utilize them after all, huh? So white sacrificed the exchange and then we just sack it back with rook c5. It's definitely a beautiful tactic, and it winds up, by the way, if they protect their rook, guys, we're obviously not going to take their rook, right? We're going to go for the more valuable pawn and then just be up a pawn with the beautiful bishop, kind of similar to what I had in the game. But when I started analyzing this game afterwards with the computer kind of really surprised me with its both its decision of what to do for white and also just the evaluation of the position. So white is just supposed to give up this pawn, make no attempts to hold it or to gain back material, and play a move on the other side of the board like g4. So I have to say, this really was not on my radar, which, I think is natural, right? Because it seems like the action is on the queen side. Why would you suddenly start looking at this? But the idea is you're preparing your kingside play, so you're going to give up this pawn, and then you're just going to move your knight away. And it turns out that, black won a pawn, but it's still pretty hard for him to use it because the queenside pawns are not going anywhere. And meanwhile, white wants to go knight g3, knight f5, and, maybe h4 at some point after that. Just play on the kingside. And there's still, residual problems in black's position, like this passive bishop on b7. By the way, you might ask, well, why should you even go g4? Why not just knight f1? Doesn't that get the knight to g3 faster? Well, that is a better move if black takes on a5. Then indeed, your knight gets to g3, and basically you can't stop it from coming into f5. It's obviously going to be extremely powerful there with like numerous threats against your king, not to mention the fork. You can't play g6 because you lose that pawn on h6. But the little issue with knight f1 is that there's actually this move, which is stopping knight g3, threatening to go f4, and black is choosing not to win material, but to also initiate play on the king side, with the point that if the pawn takes, we're going to finally activate that bishop, and the game is going to be fine for black. So that's why the computer, even though these ideas are similar, actually prefers this move, right? So the advantage it has is that it's more prophylactic. Yeah, it stops the f5 idea. Of course, guys, this is a pretty high-level example, I think. It's pretty difficult to just allow your opponent to capture material while you ignore that and start playing on the other side of the board with moves that are not even super forcing. Yeah, it's very hard to do. And, even sitting on the black side of this position, all of my attention was really on this pawn, right? So even though, I understood that bishop takes was not really my problem, but I was still investing a lot of my energy into the other possibility, which was rook takes. And really, that was all that I was concerned about in terms of what I thought was important here. And, I can't even say that it's maybe completely wrong because, it's not like white's options, other options are as forcing, right? So knight f1 or g4, they're not terribly forcing moves. So of course, black will have some leeway to respond to them. But at the same time, I feel like I didn't even kind of understand that this was a powerful concept, right? That white could just give up the pawn and switch the pieces over to the other side of the board, and there would be adequate compensation for this pawn. Right. So what do I think is the lesson from a position like this? Yeah, I think it's important, guys, when you're facing big decisions. And, this is certainly one of them. It's a crossroads, right? You're facing the loss of material. You can focus your energy on trying to keep the material balanced or not. You do have to kind of keep in mind about the concessions that you're making, right? Like in general, keeping material even with this kind of decision where you're giving up the most valuable piece in your position and you're giving up the whole dark square complex to your opponent is rarely going to be worth it, right? So yeah, you're even in material, but you're losing in position quite clearly. So that's the first thing, is like hold on to what's really valuable in your position. Don't be tempted to give it up, even if it means keeping material parity. Try to look for other solutions. And yeah, sometimes I guess losing a side pawn is not such a tragedy, right? There are a lot of strengths about White's position here if he chooses to capitalize on them. You know, this pawn is incredibly powerful, clamping down on the black pieces, right? So White can, build on that space advantage by making sure that Black cannot undermine it with f5, and White can initiate play on the other side of the board.